Thank you, Peg. Thank you for having me here. And what a great turnout in an amazing space. I'm so happy to be here. Do you remember when you had to write your first research papers in high school, and in order to get started, you would look up the definition of whatever it was you were supposed to be writing about and use that as your first sentence. Webster's dictionary says that. I actually looked up impulse, embarrassed to admit, because I was thinking about it, and I felt I needed the exact definition. And of course, we know the standard definition about acting impulsively. That was the first definition, and then I got to the physics definition, which relates to what happens in a collision, and the impulse is apparently the change in the velocity of an object or something like that. I'm actually married to a physicist, but since I'm a fiction writer, the words sort of strung together don't really mean what they mean to him. But this object can either increase in momentum, decrease in momentum, or change course. So I thought it would be appropriate to read from the beginning of my novel, since the opening describes the main character in a sort of collision with a situation, a person who turns out to be very important later in life, although she doesn't find that out for many years, for 20 years, and the book goes back and forth in time. So that's the preface that I'll read, and then the first chapter describes an actual physical collision that her son is in. I'll read the chapter where she finds out he's been in a terrible car accident, and that begins the book. So, without further ado, please. London, the year I turned 20. I wore a winter coat, the first I'd ever owned, a man's coat purchased at a second-hand store. I wore it every day with a silk scarf tied around my neck, imagining I looked arty or sophisticated. Each scarf cost £1, and I bought them from an Indian woman who kept a stall in the tube station at Victoria, where I caught my train to work. They were thin, crinkled things, not the sort of scarves that ought to be worn to work in an office or that offered any protection against the cold. But I could not resist them, their weightlessness and soft, faint colors. The money I spent on them and the habit I adopted of wearing a different one each day seems to me now a haphazard indulgence, an attempt to prove that I was the kind of girl capable of throwing herself headlong into an affair with her boss, a married man twice her age, and escaping without consequence. Church, he said, the morning I arrived at the address the woman at the agency had printed out on a card, Malcolm Church. He extended his hand, and right away I was struck by a certain contradiction in him. The impressive height and mass of him in opposition to his stooped shoulders, his hesitant manner, his unwieldy arms and legs. He had a strange way of talking, his head tucked into his neck and his eyes fixed in the empty space beyond, as if something were suspended there, ripe fruit or a glimmer of light, as if he were not quite brave enough, or perhaps too polite, to look a person in the eye. The office was a single room upstairs from a sandwich shop with 2 desks, industrial gray carpet, and 2 folding metal chairs. On one desk was an unusual photograph of a woman and a baby, a posed black and white image with a startling play of silver light and shadow set against a background of trees and sky. A single smudge of pink had been hand-painted over the baby's lips. It was Malcolm's family, his wife, Louise, who would feature so prominently in my thoughts, and their infant daughter, Daisy, who was by then 10 years old. I was to learn later that the photo had been taken by a young man named Patrick Ardgall, the son of an old family friend who was currently living in the cottage out back of Malcolm and Louise's house in Richmond. In the photo, Louise had blonde hair and a fine straight nose and a smile with a hint of impatience in it. Perhaps not with the baby per se, but with the general condition of motherhood into which Louise had finally plunged. She didn't have the temperament for motherhood, Malcolm told me later. It overwhelmed and exhausted her, and the delivery had nearly killed her, the baby, Daisy, having inherited from her father a rather large head. Sometimes people laugh when I read that, and sometimes they don't. So thank you to those of you who gave me a giggle. I moved from a youth hostel in Earl's Court to a boarding house in Victoria. My room was 10 feet square with bright blue walls. There were bathrooms down the hall. There were no showers, only a single tub and a hose you attached to the faucet for washing your hair. There was no lock on the room with the bathtub, so I made a habit of propping a chair in front of the door for privacy. The chair, as I recall, did not stop Patrick Ardgall. Nothing much stopped Patrick when he had an idea in his mind. He simply shoved the door hard, and I welcomed him, I suppose, as I always did, and he undressed and climbed in. And this is the sentence I always skip when my kids are in the room. Our wet bodies were awkwardly entangled long enough to please him, then he left, as he always did, taking my heart with him. My rent was £60 a week, including breakfast and dinner. The meals were served buffet style in the dining room downstairs. There were eggs and toast and stewed tomatoes for breakfast, meat pie or fish and chips or baked ham for dinner. It was a source of solidarity among the other boarders to complain about the food, but I could not, in good conscience, join in. I loved those meals, the bounty and efficiency of them, the thick gravies, the custards and puddings and soft, fat rolls. It seemed a small miracle to me to have so much available and to be paying for it all with my own wages. It pleased me, too, each time I handed over a pound coin in exchange for a scarf, and when I purchased at the second-hand shop in Notting Hill the winter coat, a full-length, single-breasted gray tweed with covered buttons and a wide collar that could be turned up against the cold. I wore my coat and scarf and descended the escalator into the bowels of Victoria Station, emerging again into the dense, unyielding energy of city life, feeling brisk and stylish and superior to the person I'd been when I'd left home. I was taken over by a sense of liberation and possibility. Any false steps I made now would be mine alone. Any foolish moves would be private business that had no bearing on the hopes and dreams of others, and that would not later be a source of remorse or reckoning or pain. What a shock to discover, some 20 years later, that exactly the opposite was true. To learn in the aftermath that I hadn't known the half of it. To stand in my San Francisco kitchen last June and slip my finger through the flap of a white envelope, and to find a black and white photograph of myself in that tweed coat, standing on the chalk down of the white cliffs of Dover, waiting to board a ferry to Paris. It was a photograph innocent enough to anyone unacquainted with its history, its treacherous biological imperatives, its call for reparations left unpaid. It had been solarized, just as the photo of Louise and the baby had been. It had been subjected to a light source in the darkroom, causing a reversal of dark and light. My form and Malcolm's, along with the inch of air between us, were bathed in silver light that brightened at the edges like a halo. Louise and Patrick, on the other side of the photo, were deep in shadow. The scarf I was wearing had been hand-colored a blunt red. It was tied around my neck like a choker, like a noose, but it wasn't me who was about to hang. Thank you. And then I'll read a bit from chapter 1, and all you need to know is that the narrator is addressing her son, who cannot hear her, but so it's kind of a letter to him, but more a letter to herself. It's not always wise to assume that just because the surface of the world appears undisturbed, life is where you left it. Monday morning, September 5th, 2011, 20 minutes after 8. I was doing the breakfast dishes when the phone rang. I wiped one hand on a dishcloth and picked up on the second ring. I spoke a quiet hello. You were sleeping directly upstairs in your sister's room, and after the commotion of the night before, I didn't want the noise to wake you. There was static on the line. I was about to launch into my national do not call list speech when a stranger spoke your name. I said what I believed, that you were still asleep. You couldn't come to the phone. The stranger corrected me with a contusion of words. Automobile accident, broken rib cage, possible brain injury, blunt renal trauma. I began to shake. I called for your father. I thrust the phone at him as if it were burning my hand. Part of me was certain I would find you where I'd left you, on top of your sister's bed, her decorative pillow shaped like a ballet shoe still cradling your head. I flung open the door to her room. I stepped toward the bed, but you weren't in it. Your truck was in the driveway, Robbie, but you were nowhere in the house. We learned later that you'd been riding in the passenger seat of an old Volvo sedan when it flipped just north of Santa Cruz. The driver's seatbelt had held, yours had not. Jonathan and I battled our way through the San Francisco traffic and sped 30 miles south on the highway, out of the fog and into the sunlight. We reached the peninsula and took the off-ramp and argued over the route in voices clipped with panic. We made our way through that alien topography, the university with its low, wide sandstone buildings and flat expanses of sky and lawn, the shopping center with its vats of flowers and its acres of parking lot, the hospital inside its immaculate suburbia, that sunlit peninsula pressed between the green bay and a bank of hills the color of straw that 5 months later your father would begin to call home. We drove up the hospital's main drive and circled the extravagant brick fountain, an oasis of shaped trees growing in its center. I was the one who'd counted your drinks the night before. I was the one who'd somehow incited a riot, then in the aftermath set about making sure my 3 children were safe for the night under the same roof. I was the one who'd moved a sleeping Polly in with Clara so you could have Polly's bed. If I had not made you stay, if I had not altered that sliver of fate, if I had not plucked that single wing from that single butterfly, you wouldn't have ended up in that car. You'd have said your goodbyes and driven across the Bay Bridge to Berkeley and fallen into bed and slept until noon. My son just got accepted to UC Berkeley, but of course I wrote this years and years ago. At the main entrance to the hospital were 2 dogs, eyes half closed, chins flat on the ground in a posture of patient defeat. That was the attitude to avoid. The task at hand, my task, was not to wait patiently, but to act, to undo the twist of fate, to be vigilant and merciless in advocating for your medical care, to accept nothing less than a full recovery, to ask every question and overturn every stone. Did I suspect that first morning that there were some stones better left buried in the dust? That I might wish for the results of certain biological interrogations to be kept hidden, not only from you and your father, but from myself? I don't think I did. Denial, as any addict in recovery will tell you, is not defined as knowing something and pretending you don't. It is failing to see it at all.